All right, so we should be ready to start. Welcome back to this lecture on roasting. I met Rob a few years ago, like only 2 years ago, and working with him to help people translate sort of what they were doing on a traditional roaster, and when they sort of were looking at buying a Loring, he was there to help consult sort of and help the transition between one technology to the other. And nice guy, did really good presentation after the SCAA show, and suddenly he just pops up 2 years after, he's already written a book, you know. It's just amazing. This guy is running fast, and he's been working with coffee for 11 years, first as a barista, and then he got into roasting. And as he said, when he got into roasting, he was trying to get knowledge, and he just couldn't. And he thought that people just didn't want to tell him about it, but actually he felt there was a void there, and he's already trying to fill it out with this book that just came out in March, was it? Yeah. And it's here for sale also. He's brought about 20 copies, I think, and you can get it signed as well. And I like also the fact that he's calling it a manifesto, one roaster's manifesto, so it's not like the book about how you do things, it's just, you know, how he sees it as a contribution. So please, everyone, welcome Rob Hose.
I hope you like the mood lighting. Hope this is okay. We turned it down just so we could see some of the slides a little bit better. I've always found that the best way to start off any conversation is with a little self-deprecating humor, so if you'll indulge me for 1 minute. I'll tell you why I always do the break during cupping with one eye open. I don't know if you guys have noticed me doing this. You know, originally I started closing my eyes to try and lock out any other sensory stimulus that I would be getting, so I could just concentrate on the aroma. And then unfortunately it wasn't once, but it was actually twice, that I ducked down too far and snorted in the actual cap. And it hurt really badly. So I've actually just closing one eye now to block out at least some of the stimuli, but make sure that I'm also not getting too close to the cup. So, you know. If you see me doing it, I'm not pretending to be a pirate. I'm actually just trying to protect myself from my past. So, as Jens alluded to, we wrote a book called Modulating the Flavor Profile of Coffee, and part of the reasoning and just the very basic background behind why this existed was when I first moved from being a barista into being a roaster, I had a lot of questions that weren't easy to answer. At first I thought it was because I lived in the Midwest. I lived in a small town in Ohio where there were not very many roasters, and the roasters that were there weren't willing to share. And then I thought that I would be able to learn through different venues, and every venue I would go to I'd find that, you know, if I wanted to know how a change in the actual roast profile affected the flavor of a coffee, there wasn't any sort of reliable way of getting answers to that. So what I ended up doing was I bought a 1 kilo roaster, and I just started experimenting. Basically, there we go, let's go on this next slide here. Basically what I wanted to do was try and take the roast curve and break it down into some number of steps. I wasn't sure exactly how many I would end up with when I started. That were independently controllable, that would influence the flavor of the coffee, and that would have some sort of connection with the chemical or physical change. Because from the scientific perspective, I felt that the chemistry of coffee as it's changing in the roaster is the single most important thing related to flavor. It's not the roaster itself, it's not the type of roaster, it's actually the process that the beans are going through, the chemical changes and the physical changes that they're going through in the roaster. So I figured that if I could break this down and dismantle it and try and understand the components, I would have a better shot at actually understanding how the profile is affecting the flavor. So basically what I did is I looked for things that were independently controllable, they were somehow measurable, so they had to have some sort of signifier, and I wanted these to be independent of a roaster manufacturer or a thermocouple type. As we all know, one of the common frustrations in the industry is if I say, what's your first crack temperature for the same coffee, everyone's going to give a slightly different answer because the temperature probes read very differently. So it had to have something that was not just a thermocouple reading associated with it in order to be measurable, linked with some sort of chemical reaction or physical change. And so what started off with 3 segments ended up being 5 segments. So what I hope to do today is present to you what I would consider the 5 major segments that are controllable and independently change the flavor of the coffee, and then dive into each one of those segments and talk a little bit more in depth. So does that sound good? Okay, I'm also very interactive, so it's hard to wait for questions, but I will wait, but I'll ask questions of you and hopefully get responses. So you did really well the first time. Usually people just look at me like, we'll go on here. So the basic 5 points, when I first started, I figured the phase during the Maillard reactions and the development phase, or development time as people often refer to it in roasting, were going to be two of the primary ones, along with the end temperature. So I started with those three. And at the end I ended up adding also the drying phase as well as the total roast time and pressure formation, which we'll go into a little bit. So kind of starting beginning to end, we're talking about the drying phase, the Maillard reaction phase, development phase, the extent to which sugars are caramelized, and then the total roast time and the pressure formation. So that's kind of the roadmap to how we're going to dive into this today. So the drying phase. When I say drying phase, I mean everything that happens before visible chemical reactions have started. Typically speaking, when we're thinking about chemical reactions starting, we typically call them started at the change to yellow. Is this similar for everybody here?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So let's kind of dive into what that segment means. So we're talking about the initial charge into the roaster all the way up to the point of yellowing. And this curve is not to scale, not even close. It's just meant to be a visual reference. So if you're like, man, you're drying that coffee for a hell of a long time. Yeah, it's just for reference there. So the roadmap for me of the drying phase goes like this. The initial phase of roasting coffee can cause roasting defects, scorching and tipping, which we'll talk about very briefly, which are going to be negative or detrimental to the actual flavor of the coffee. The initial stages of roasting are also responsible for a number of things apart from causing chemical reactions. These would be establishing the thermal momentum of the batch, driving off free moisture content, and then building of internal pressure within the coffee seed. So first we're going to dive in and talk just a little bit about basic roasting defects. I'm sure you're familiar with them, so I won't belabor the point, with the exception of tipping, which is my favorite defect and sets the stage for some later things as well. Scorching comes from too much conductive heat energy transfer at the very beginning of the roast. Basically, the metal itself has become too hot, and so as the coffee seeds drop in, they will actually burn or char slightly at every point at which they touch. Usually this is going to be when the coffee is green or yellow, and you'll see little black speckles appearing on the outside of the coffee seed. It can happen for a number of different reasons. It's going to be a little bit manufacturer dependent as to why, but it basically just means you are putting too much conductive heat energy transfer at the beginning of the roast. Tipping is going to be caused by too rapid of heat transfer. Tipping is when you see a black mark only on one end of the seed, and we'll get into the mechanisms of that here in a second. Typically speaking, this is blamed on convection heat energy transfer. Has anybody heard that before? Convection is what causes tipping. Part of the reason for that is just that convection is an incredibly efficient means of heat transfer. This was innovated into the roasting in the early 1900s, historically speaking. Before then, batch sizes were relatively small, roast times were relatively large. The modern roast sizes and times are all due to convective heating transfer. At a lecture I was attending at the SCA, the owner of Probot said that in a Probot machine, it's a 70-30 split. 70% is actually convective heat energy transfer, and 30% is conduction in their roasters. So convection is a large part of heat transfer in roasting, and that's why it gets blamed for this, because it's the only form that can really transfer heat fast enough in order to cause the tipping defect. And it's caused by steam rapidly escaping from the soft spot on the bean. So basically what's happening, here we have the coffee seed, right? We're going to be applying heat to the outside of the coffee seed. This is where coffee actually becomes incredibly fascinating. The outer shell of the coffee seed is dense enough that the water vapor that's being developed inside as heat's being applied, there's a pressure wall that's moving inward, or a steam wall that's moving inward. And the steam can't escape the seed fast enough, or as fast as it's being generated. So all this steam actually starts to build pressure inside of the seed. Okay, we'll touch on this a little bit later too, but according to research done by Ilian Vivaldi and Espresso, the Science of Quality, this can be up to 25 times atmosphere. For reference, an espresso machine is 9 times atmosphere, 9 bars. So 25 bars of pressure is potential at this point. Anybody know what the softest part on the coffee seed is? It's the tip where the embryo would have germinated. This is why tipping only happens on one side. So what happens is, where the density is the weakest, the steam will begin to move out. The pressure is developed, it's too much pressure for the density of the softest part on the bean, it begins to shoot steam out the backside. As it shoots steam out the backside, a small black spot will begin to appear. This is the charring that we know is tipping. Okay? This is also part of the reason why you see it on Quakers a lot more. Quakers aren't quite formed properly, and so Quakers will often have a tipping defect even if the rest of the batch is totally fine. But that's why. It's too much heat being applied too rapidly. The density or the cell structure can't actually hold the pressure that's being formed, and it begins shooting steam out the bottom. So this is going to come into play a couple other times later on, but I find this to be my favorite defect, even though I don't really care for the taste of it, obviously. But it's more complex than some of the other ones where it's just like, oh, that was against metal for too long, so it's burned. In addition, we're going to be establishing thermal momentum during this drying phase. Most roasters are not able to come from a completely cold or room temperature environment and roast a full batch just using the burner, right? I don't know that any can actually really do that well. So what we rely on is actually the thermal energy that we're able to store up in the roaster. During the drying phase, we're going to be applying a heck of a lot of heat. Part of the reason is we're going to be driving off free moisture content, but also we need to establish that thermal momentum. So we're charging the batch, we're getting all the metal really hot, we're getting the air inside the roaster hot, we're dropping the coffee in, and then we're getting it up to speed really rapidly. Okay, this is going to be somewhat machine dependent based on how much thermal momentum you're developing. Your roasting style, all that sort of stuff comes in influence. I try never to judge whatever your roasting style is or preference. That's totally fine. As long as you're not creating defect and you like it, I really can't say too much about it. My goal is just to help you understand how things may shift and move around flavor-wise with that. But this is obviously strongly connected to the charge weight and the charge temperature. In addition, we're going to be driving off free moisture content. Agriculturally, coffee's drives at between 10 and 12% moisture content, allowable up to 13 if it's a natural, right? This water content in the seed actually prohibits certain chemical reactions from happening. Basically what happens is the water dilutes the chemical compounds that need to bump into each other in order to react, such as the Maillard reaction. And because of this, the reaction doesn't quite start. This is why we actually have to take coffee through a drying process. We see the bean go from green to pale white before actually beginning to turn yellow. So the moisture loss happens before the chemical reactions begin to happen. So this is a very necessary phase as well. So basically we need to be driving off the water as fast as, in a controlled manner as we would like to, without creating a defect, which would be a typical defect. And then the building of internal pressure. And though there aren't really notable chemical reactions that happen during the, for lack of a better term, drying phase, basically it's setting the stage for the rest of the roast. So the amount of pressure that you're building in the seed during this phase will actually have a determining effect on how the rest of the roast will progress. So even though the drying phase isn't doing anything per se, it is setting the stage for how all the other chemical reactions are going to happen. So in that way, it is contributing and controlling some of the flavor. So once again, heating the bean combined with the off-gassing of water, or the inability for the water to actually off-gas out the seed, is going to basically make each individual coffee seed its own little pressure cooker and develop up to 25 times atmosphere, although probably less for most seeds. I would imagine it would take quite a dense seed to withstand the full 25 atmospheres. But this is going to change the rate at which chemical reactions happen. We cook meat faster in a pressure cooker, right? If you have a pressure cooker and you put meat in there, it's going to cook faster than in a normal cooking situation because all the compounds are forced into closer contact with each other. So it's going to increase the rate of chemical reaction. We actually see a similar sort of pathway happening in roasting. So we're going to move on to the Maillard reaction. Once again, we've got this section right here. Typically speaking, we're going to be describing the Maillard reaction as the beginning of color change to yellow. And I measure it, for my sake, all the way up to the beginning of first crack. Partially because we don't necessarily know when the Maillard reaction stops happening, but we start measuring other things at first crack, and so it's just a really nice place to make a break. So it's going to be dependent on the chemical makeup of the green coffee when it's beginning and ending. So. The Maillard reaction is basically this. Amino acids act as catalysts with reducing sugars. Reducing sugars, we're not talking about sucrose, we're talking about fructose, maltose, all these other sorts of oses that exist within the coffee, but not the sucrose per se. During this, we're going to be actually creating 600 volatile aromatic compounds or more. Basically, it's a really, really fun reaction where the reaction happens, and then it comes back in contact with these catalysts, and then happens again and creates more intermediate products that come in contact with those catalysts, and then happens again. And basically, it just continues to cascade until it's either run out of reactants, Strecker degradation does its thing and diminishes the amount of amino acids which are facilitating this, or you're ending the roast. Unsure as to when that's happening, but for our sake, we're just going to call it first crack. One of the other fun things is it generates melanoids. This is usually where, if I was in an American audience, would make a joke about a Domino's Pizza commercial, where there was this crazy rabbit-looking thing called the Noid, and he would come and ruin your pizza's freshness. These are not the same thing. These are not a crazy man in a red rabbit suit. However, these are high molecular weight Browning compounds that are created during the Maillard reaction. So these are the actual Browning compounds. They have been linked through research with flavor binding, color, texture, and antioxidant properties. They do tend to link up with chlorogenic acids, which we know have antioxidant properties as well. In addition to that, they have a very high molecular weight. High molecular weight has a correlation with viscosity, and viscosity has a correlation with how we experience the body of something that we're consuming. Typically speaking, the more viscous, the heavier it's going to feel in the mouth. The less viscous, the lighter it's going to feel in the mouth. So not only during the Maillard reaction are we producing a significant amount of complexity, but we are also creating high molecular weight Browning compounds which are linked to flavor binding, texture, and viscosity specifically. Okay, so those are some of the things that we're controlling with this. Got a nice little fun color change graphic here that you can enjoy while we're talking. It begins when the bean turns from pale white to yellow. Beginning of color change is the first and easiest way of noting the beginning of Maillard. Likely it's happening before we can actually visibly see it happening, but we have to have something that we can use across different production roasters. The scientific side of things is absolutely wonderful in how they do their measurements, but for us we need kind of like a rubber meets the road sort of thing, so color change to yellow is a great way to deal with that. And then we're going to be tracking it to the beginning of first crack. The basic changes that we're going to notice here is that the longer that the reaction continues, the greater the number of byproducts. The greater number of byproducts, the greater the amount of complexity in the cup. So typically speaking, the longer you allow the Maillard reaction to occur, or to a greater extent you allow it to occur, the more complex the cup will be. In addition to this, as the Maillard reaction is continuing, it's producing more and more melanoids or Browning compounds. Those are going to be linked with body, and body is also going to change to a great degree how we experience the complexity. Unfortunately, we as human beings are not as analytical as we'd like to think when it comes to taste, and we're influenced by a myriad of things happening at the same time. If there's time at the end, I'll give an example of that, but I want to make sure to get through the stuff we're here. Body then, as the Maillard reaction continues, the number of melanoids increase. The increase of melanoids is going to increase the molecular weight of the beverage, which is going to increase the viscosity and what we experience as body. So typically speaking, both through the blind cuppings that I was doing with multiple varieties, or cultivars of coffee, from different origins, different altitudes, different processing methods, on different roasters, the longer that this phase occurs, the heavier the mouthfeel, and the greater the complexity. The shorter that this section occurs, the lighter the body, the lower the complexity. As with most things in coffee, though, there is a little bit of a trade-off, because you're trading off clarity. Okay? As the Maillard reaction is continuing, you're getting more and more complexity, heavier body, you lose out on some of the clarity that the coffee has to offer. Okay? So as the complexity and body increase, clarity of the beverage decreases. It's always going to be a trade-off. We're going to talk about a few other areas in which coffee roasting is a trade-off between different flavors, where you can either pick a balanced approach or you can pick accentuating one or the other. But this is kind of just a really generic way of looking at it. Once again, this is for visual effect and is not even close to scale. So I unfortunately don't have a gas chromatograph or mass spec in my garage, but these are really wonderful. I did a ton of reading for all this though, so Google Scholar is one of my favorite things of all time because you can get access to a lot of different periodicals. All right, let's move on then to talk about development time. We're doing great time-wise, so that's a good thing. Development time is, it's a very complex nut to crack, okay? This is one of the things that we're more familiar with as roasters, right? Everybody here measures development time, right? Show of hands. Anybody? Everybody? Good. Right on. This is the most common. You hear people talk about development time in pretty much every roasting application that you talk about. It's denoted as the time between the beginning of first crack, and we're not usually talking about the very first bean that cracks, but the beginning of the actual batch beginning to crack, until the end of the roast. Is typically where we're defining it. If you go very dark, you may be defining it from the beginning of first crack till the beginning of second crack. Different people have slightly different interpretations. But it's very complex. During this phase, we have sugar caramelization happening. Pyrolysis and carbonization are also occurring, depending on how dark you're going. I mean, they're happening to some extent one way or another, but whether or not they're prevalent. The Maillard reaction is possibly continuing if it had enough byproducts to make it through to this stage. Strecker degradation, which is where amino acids are being broken down into aldehydes, which taste like butterscotch and vanilla and some really lovely malty things like that. And then we have organic acid breakdown and formation. So there's a lot that's actually happening during this phase. Through the different blind cuppings, one of the things that I noticed that was most greatly accentuated, if everything else was held standard except for the development time, was the way that the acid changes. So what we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about is organic acid changes during this phase of roasting, and then we'll pay homage to pyrolysis, sugar caramelization, and all that sort of stuff here in just a minute. So, yeah, organic acids, there's a correlation between the organic acid content and the time between first crack and the end of the roast. Theoretically, time could inform the evenness of the roast throughout the bean, and how the concentration of organic acids are being experienced by our tongues and in our retronasal. Okay, typically speaking, our tongues are actually detecting acidity, but sometimes you taste other things that aren't just acidity when you're tasting the pure acids. Like to me, citrus has a really nice floral component to it, or something that I associate with floral. Apple has like that apple skin, sort of also kind of floral, but different than citrus. So it's not just a straight, I'm picking this up with my tongue, my retronasal is actually getting a little bit off of it as well. Yes, let's dive on into this. So some of the acids, both organic and inorganic, present in green coffee are going to degrade through the course of roasting. Citric acid, malic acid, which are two of my personal favorites. No offense if anybody else has a different favorite acid, we can agree to disagree on that. Chlorogenic acid, all these three are typically degrading at different rates, and depending on the concentration that the coffee originally started with, you're going to end up with a different end product, depending on how you're roasting it. Phosphoric acid is relatively quite stable. But then there are other acids that are being formed during this process as well. Acetic acid, formic acid, or formed may not be the best way, are increasing during this phase. Acetic, formic, kenic, kephetic, citratonic, fumaric, maleic, lactic, tartaric, glycolic, and the list goes on, right? So it's going to get really fun. We're going to actually throw up some graphs because all this is just words on a screen until you see it, at least for me. So this is an example from Lenther, and what I always like to say is Death Rage. It looks like his last name, which is a fantastic last name. He should be in a metal band. But development time with citric acid. So citric acid is present in green coffee and degrades during the course of roasting. For me, tasting notes would be pleasant, floral, hibiscus, or fruit blossom, and obviously reminiscent of a citrus fruit, like an orange. I'm mad with citrus fruits. When blood orange season hits in the US, I have 2 or 3 a day. I love that stuff. So this is an example that shows concentration over temperature. Okay, we need to keep in mind, even though we're talking about development time, we want to think about it in terms of degradation due to temperature change. And I'll go into how those two are linked here in just a moment. Malic acid, both of these are from the same publication, and both of them deal with the Colombian coffee. And I'll bring up a slide that has the proper credits here in just a second. Malic acid is present in green coffee and degrades during the course of roasting. Floral, slightly bitter, dry, reminiscent of apple skin or apple flesh for me. But it's also degrading during the course of temperature. When we throw those two together on the exact same scale, it's really interesting to see how for this particular coffee that they were studying, this is how the coffee's acids broke down due to temperature. Okay. In addition, we have other acids that are being formed. So here's another picture, and this is actually in Celsius, where the others were in Fahrenheit. Acetic acid is being formed by the degradation of sucrose sugar. So as sucrose sugar breaks down during caramelization, it actually forms acetic acid. Other acids are also being formed through the breakdown of pre-existing organic acids. The initial types and balances of all these acids are totally dependent on the green coffee. The farmer is really the one who's helping us control the potential of a coffee. The farming, the processing, all that sort of stuff. We as roasters just get to play with that potential and decide how we're going to express it. Okay? Here are the references for the graphs if you want to do any fact checking. So feel free to check it out. They're wonderful publications as well to read through. So, Death Rage, that's my next metal band, if I was ever in a band. So here's kind of what it looks like. It's a little bit of a mess, right? Everything's happening kind of at the same time. Things are breaking down while other things are being created and generated. Other things are staying fairly stable. So through experimental knowledge and experimentation and well thought out modifications, you basically get to pick the mixture of your organic acids in your coffee. And we're going to talk about that here. But the key is basically to highlight the positive acids while making sure that those with detrimental flavor impacts are being minimized. Now, this is going to be based on your personal preference. Your preference for organic acid composition, mine might be entirely different. But the way that this works out pragmatically is because the coffee bean is so thermodynamically complex, because of the shape of the coffee bean, the chemical reactions it's undergoing, and the physical changes that are happening to it, heat does not progress evenly through the coffee seed. Therefore, different layers are going to be exposed to different temperatures simultaneously. So for example, we may have a coffee that looks like this, or a coffee that looks like this. It's a very small difference, so I'll switch between it a few times, right? So the evenness is completely different, right? Everybody can see that? Oop, keep going here. Yeah. So development time is actually talking about the thoroughness of the heat application across the entire seed. If you were to take a coffee to the exact same terminal temperature and have a short development time versus a long development time, the evenness of the roast through the seed is going to be different. You'd see this on the delta between the whole bean and the ground agtron, right? So we have a little bit of a difference of how much of the coffee is actually being developed. What that does for us, because remember, these things break down due to temperature, so the change in time is controlling the actual basic size of the window of the organic acid you're looking at, okay? So for example, let's say we have a really short development time and we have some of the coffees developed fully, some of it hasn't developed fully. So it's kind of hard to see, and I won't stand in front because I got a little laser pointer. So here's one edge of the window, and here's the other edge. Because we have this disparity between the amount of doneness, essentially, or roast in the coffee, we have this wider range of organic acids. More complex, some of the acids that maybe we wanted to get rid of are still potentially there. Some of the more green sort of tasting acids. But basically, by doing a shorter development time, we're choosing to look at a larger picture of the organic acid composition of the seed. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Sweet. Okay, so let's say we have a longer development time. We get a more even cooking of the bean. And so we see a smaller window of the organic acid composition because organic acids break down due to temperature. However, time is controlling how much that heat can infiltrate the seed. Okay, so we have a smaller window of the organic acid composition of the seed. Okay? Everybody good with that as well?
Yeah.
Sweet. So just kind of giving it a really big, broad brush stroke, what I've noticed trend-wise in tasting all these coffees was here's how the flavor tends to develop for me. When it's a really short development time, it tends to be very bright, potentially metallic or vegetal, with a low fruit correlation. So it's acidic, and you can tell that it's acidic and bright, but there's not really a positive fruit correlation. It's just kind of meh, right? With that same coffee, as it continues to progress a little bit further into development, we have a bright and sour, but pleasant bitterness with fruit association. So we begin to get certain fruit tones that come out. As we continue progressing, it becomes bright and balanced with a sweet fruit correlation. Moving further, softer and sweet with a fruit correlation. And then finally, if the development time has gone significantly far, neutral or dull with low acidity and low fruit correlation. So this is kind of what I've noticed across different cultivars, different origins, different processing methods on different roasters, is it kind of shows up about the same way. So I can't ask any questions, which is what I would normally do there, because we're going to save this till the end. So if you have a question, just go ahead and throw that into your mind right there. We're going to talk about caramelization real quick. We've got about 5 minutes to get through that, so we're in good shape here. The primary sugar in green coffee is sucrose sugar. Sucrose sugar turns to caramel during caramelization, right? No doubt. You guys are like, yeah, good, thanks. Do you know how caramel candy is made? Because usually when you think about caramel, you think about caramel candy. You're like, ah, it's really sweet. Well, actually, no. Caramel is a very bitter compound. The reason caramel candy is sweet is because we're taking a milk product and sugar, like sucrose, combining them and then heating it very carefully. And what we're trying to do is caramelize the lactose sugar in the dairy product and not all of the sucrose sugar, so that we have this really nice sweet treat that has the nice caramel tones and the bitterness starting to balance it out. So burnt caramel, to a certain extent, isn't really burnt caramel, it's just caramel, right? It's bitter, it's complex, this sort of thing. We only have so much sucrose sugar to deal with in our coffee seed. The degree to which we roast it, or the darkness to which we choose to roast the coffee, is what is creating that caramelization. It's kind of like in beer brewing or in wine. You have an initial gravity and you have a final gravity. Depending on how much sugar you have initially, what type of yeast you choose, what the conditions are, all that sort of stuff. You can have a sweet beer at the end, or you can have a dry beer at the end. With coffee, we have so much sucrose sugar, we can take it through caramelization and make it balanced. We can make it bitter, we can leave it sweet. We have these sorts of choices. So this is just a visualization once again. At a certain point, there are vegetal compounds. If you don't roast it dark enough, there's some compounds that are a little bit more astringent that linger. Then we get into sweet with some balance, sweet and balance, shifting toward bitter, and then finally bitter and more woody as we continue to progress. Once again, not assigning any value to any of these, so far as better or worse, but just giving you an idea of where you're going with the control of that. This is also fun. It's the SCA Cup Taster's Wheel. It just kind of gives you an interesting idea. Usually it's like, oh, roast light to dark, right? As it travels around here, you can see. This is just a helpful tool. It's by no means exhaustive or meant to be used as an exhaustive tool for that, but it gives you some ideas of different flavors that you can have come out during different levels of caramelization. Finally, let's talk about the pressure development in the roast. This is a little bit more esoteric, but I think it's a really fun and fascinating thing. So, pressure generated is thought to be crucial for flavor development and aroma. This is cited by Illy. This is cited in Coffee Flavor Chemistry by Ivan Flement, and a few other publications. And when I originally ran into this when I was doing my research and roasting, that was all I could figure. There's like, oh, it's important. I'm like, cool, why? And it wasn't until a little bit later doing some experimentation and spending time studying some other roasters and what they were up to, that I realized that the pressure development is what is actually causing the pressure cooker sort of scenario, right? If you think of coffee as a giant pressure cooker that can hold, potentially up to 25 times atmosphere, basically the more pressure you're developing the seed by how quickly you're roasting it, the faster you're applying the heat, the more pressure is building up inside the seed, the more the pressure builds up, the faster the chemical reactions happen. Which means you can have a very short roast time, but not have vegetal or underdeveloped characteristics, if you control the profile properly. And I was seeing this in certain roasters who were doing like 5.5 minutes, 6 minutes, 7-minute roasts, and I was thinking to myself, how is this not underdeveloped? Well, the reason is they're actually utilizing this pressure to their advantage and are able to create incredible developed roasts by utilizing pressure to get the chemical reactions to happen somewhat faster. But this does happen at a cost. This is based on studies that are not done in coffee but are done in other industries, and obviously at a little bit higher pressure, because when we're talking about arresting the Maillard reaction in industrial food processing, we're talking about really, really high pressure. But the Maillard reaction tends to not like to happen as pressure increases. It kind of slows down the reaction. Therefore, that means that all the other chemical reactions that have these astringent characters or these underdeveloped characters may not exist, but you're also not going to allow the Maillard reaction to happen to the same extent, which is going to affect the body and is also going to affect the complexity. This is why when you taste a coffee that was really, really quickly roasted, but what roasted well, it tends to be very light, tea-like, and the complexity is very straightforward. It speaks a couple different flavors and it speaks them very loudly, whereas if you have a longer roast, a lot of times you will have a lot more flavors, a lot more nuance, the body will be a little bit heavier, that sort of thing. So this is kind of how that's functioning. Here's a giant breakdown of basically everything we've talked about. So just kind of to reinforce things. The drying phase is going to remove the excess free water to encourage chemical reaction. It's going to establish thermal momentum in the pressure of the batch early on, and it indirectly affects the flavor profile. It can also cause defects, so you have to be cautious and wary that you are applying an appropriate amount of heat and speed of roasting to the density of the coffee that you have. The Maillard reaction is going to develop complexity of body and viscosity. Typically speaking, the longer the Maillard reaction time, the more complex and the heavier with the low clarity. The shorter the Maillard time, the less complex, the less body, but the more clarity. And development time is where you're picking the development of the organic acids, the window or the size of the picture you're taking of those things. Acid degradation and formation is happening, and it's a reference to the extent of the evenness of the roast. Sugar caramelization, basically balance between sweetness and bitterness. Pyrolysis and carbonization can also happen here, and if you go too dark, you'll get some pyrolytic tones as well as carbon-oriented tones. And then finally, the entire time of the roast, or your total roast time, is going to be a reference to the actual pressure development inside of the seed, which is going to affect the rate at which many of these chemical reactions are happening. And that's it. Hey,
Thank you, Rob. Well done on the time. Thank you very much. Maybe feedback on the slide before. We just leave that for the discussion.
Perfect.
Good. So, yeah, I would like to invite some roasters up here. Joanna Al. Yeah, there you go. And Michael de Renoir. And Christian Gulbrandsen, please. And of course, the audience. So, what do you think, guys, about this presentation?
Interesting.
Yeah? Got the microphone here.
Being a Sky authorized trainer, I knew a lot of this, so this is very good material and well-made graphics. So I recognize a lot of this. We might not agree 100% on it, but we can take that afterwards.
Right on.
But, you know, you read some books.
Or now, yeah.
You read some books, I read some books. There's a lot of theory, and I'm not a scientist, so I could be wrong, of course.
Nor am I.
No.
Liberal arts major.
But very good breaking up the profile. It really gives some clarity to the picture of designing a profile.
Thank you.
So any questions, guys?
Yeah. So I can give the example about peaches, what you guys think, if you want, about the flavor I was alluding to.
Yeah.
Sound good?
Yeah.
So peaches are one of my favorite things to talk about because there are some similarities between them and certain coffees. And we once had a Guatemalan coffee that tasted like peaches, and I loved it because it reminded me of peach cobbler, which is fantastic. So when it comes to organic acid concentrations, what really trips me out is how our brain recognizes something that's fairly close to something we've tasted before so far as the organic acid composition, and then it's like, yes, that's what you're tasting, it's that. And it's like, well, it's not that at all, it's actually coffee, but our brain thinks of it that way. So some of the primary acids in a peach are going to be kenic, malic, and citric, right? Which all exist in coffee. So there's the potential to taste it, and if the balance is right, we taste peach. Well, what's really interesting is chlorogenic acid, which based on some studies I've read, tends to degrade a little faster than citric and malic, exists in unripe peaches at a higher concentration than it exists in ripe peaches. And so if you have a really short development time on a coffee that tastes like peach, and you're like, oh, it tastes like unripe peaches, well, the reason is an unripe peach literally has more chlorogenic acid left over in it with the same balance of the rest. It's kind of fun. So.
We've got a question here.
Yeah, it goes to all of the roasters on stage. Because you're working on very different machines. I mean, Christian and Mikael are working on Lorings, but in different environments and stuff, and Joanna on Dietrich. How would you approach building a profile, and do you relate to these kind of stages in the roast profile? How do you play with that?
This is going to be my whole presentation tomorrow, so... no, but I find it, like, some parts of it is so interesting. I think we're always, like, touching and working against the same factors that we do have there. I remember, for example, when like, a few years back, I focused so much on the Malic reaction, and I almost, like, baked the coffee in that process because I truly wanted to have long Malic reaction. And also when we talk about development time, now, like, for me, it's more about, I would like the beans to crack, but that's about it. Afterwards, I just think, just like you were saying as well, when we're losing this, we're adding this that we may not want. So I don't really see it as a development time. I see it more, I want the beans to crack. That's it. While you're focusing more on the time after there. You see the difference? Like, similarly?
Yeah, for us, like, one of the things we've noticed, like, a Rwandan coffee, since we've been talking a little bit about Rwandan coffee today that we had, So it had this really weird demarcation. Usually we allow a little bit of wiggle room, like 5-10 seconds on either side of a point that our roasters are supposed to hit. And this one was just crazy because we're like, okay, it's a 2-minute development time. And at 1:59, you couldn't taste fruit. At 2 minutes, you could taste fruit, and then all the way up to 2:05. So we actually had to change some of our things. So that's why one of the reasons why I focus on time is trying to understand the extent to which it's developing and when we're getting some of those. But I mean, yeah.
And how are you thinking against, like, say, development time versus temperature in that stage?
Yeah, so that's a complicated one. With the experiments, I was only controlling one variable independent, and so with development time, you're also caramelizing the sugars more thoroughly throughout. So with all the experiments we'll be tasting, it's only one thing being changed at a time. But you're absolutely right in that the longer the development, the more thorough the caramelization, as well as the change to the acid makeup as well, would be my thought. Is that good? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just want to answer your question from my point of view. Was that question for me?
Yeah, please.
What's the question?
No, should we answer Tim's question?
Yes, yes. So I travel a lot with Loring. So I have the opportunity to help people having a typically radiation roaster, and they just bought a convection roaster, a Loring. So I help them migrate profiles. So there's a lot of difference between a profile on a radiation or cast iron roaster versus a stainless steel, non-accumulative kind of roaster, which is almost pure convection. So in the first place we have the turning point that will come within the first minute. So already there we have gained about 1.5, 2 minutes. So we can cut that off normally. But the whole migration point of view is that I see how many people roast and how different roasters behave in a different way. So it's really exciting to be able to try to either reproduce or at least improve on something they have. If I can improve on anything, that's of course my primary concern, to be able to do that. I can just say that with a convection roaster, I roast faster. I have a high pressure. I have this pressure cooker effect really fast. To me, having a delta, or a big delta between the surface temperature and ground being, color, my delta between outside and inside can be up to 30 electron points, and thereby I find that my center, my core bean is underdeveloped in terms of having spared more sugars, having had less caramelization, saving both exciting acids in the flavor and aftertaste, but also leaving the bean incredibly sweet afterwards. So it's a very subtle balance. So reaching that balance without having too much roast character on the bean is how I try to roast our coffee.
And for me as well, Tim, like when I'm thinking about approaching a profile, for me it's completely independent of the thermocouple, and it's more about when the color changes are happening and for what extent those segments are allowed to run. So what we've found with just matching different people's roasts for fun is that we can trick an entire cupping team of a large third wave roaster into thinking that it was their coffee off their Probat, and it was actually their coffee off of a Loring or their coffee off of another stainless steel drum. So for me, the chemical reactions are the profile, and that's king for flavor development. So that's usually what I'm more thinking of when I'm preparing to roast something.
I am having a Diedrich roaster, and like on that, it's very, very tricky to go in on too high in temperature. So the charge temperature, I'm normally like, say, around 180 degrees, and almost all say above 200 degrees I used to scorch or tip when I did that. Now I had smells from Chris as well at 5 Elephant, like to put up the drum speed on it, and it works. I mean, that makes it more similar to your roasters. So, and then it works. So.
Because it exposes the beans to more air as they're being thrown up next to the defusion. It's awesome.
I've got something from Candice over here.
I have a lot of questions.
Louder.
Sorry. I have a lot of questions in my nature. Feel free to abuse me tomorrow. So this goes not quite to you, Robert. I really enjoyed your presentation. There are parts that I slightly not disagree with, but would shift into different segments. But I think it's one of the most thorough presentations I've seen and comprehensive in this kind of format. So thank you for that. I had a question for Michael, actually, and you know I do. When you talk about shorter development times and the difference in which loring are you referring to in terms of having that much of a differential at the end of the roast? You said not short. What times? What would you consider short?
We have 3 models of loring, 15, 35 and 70, and they're very much the same. So when I talk loring, you can take any of these 3 models. It's within, to my knowledge, 1-2 degrees temperature, because the probes are the same, they're situated in the same place. The air circulation follows the batch size and so on. So a short development time for me would be, on a small dense Ethiopian bean, would be 50 seconds, for example, as opposed to a bigger Kenya bean, which could be 90 seconds, or if it's very fresh and maybe a little greenish in the taste, I would give it maybe 10 seconds more.
And you count your development time from crack or before?
Sorry?
You're counting the development time from first crack?
Yes, yes. So I have been making my own experiments lately about having a colder or hotter middle profile, because I extended the temperature in the middle to be more, to save the bean a little more, to be a little more gentle to the bean in the development phase. So I let the profile do the most part of the work before the first crack. So my normal end temperature on a Kenya, for example, could be 210. Now I'm down to 7. So I've got 3 degrees off the development time, or temperature, end temperature. But my profile is a little bit more steep early, before first crack, and then my average temperature during from 160 to first crack is a little bit higher. So I find this gentle end treatment to make my coffees a little less roasty, sweeter, and nicer.
What changed your mind on that?
Just trying, and some critique from Tim.
I find it interesting in talking about the differences when cupping from different roasters. It's just that I've had people cup coffees that I've roasted on an A15 from you guys, non-hybrid, total conversion, and people who've sworn to me that they will get no body from an air roasted coffee, that they'll get no development, that it'll be too fast, that it won't, and it's phenomenal to be able to change people's minds and to explore with them the fact that it's a chemical process as much as it is a mechanical process, and that managing one and the other in tandem can give you the result that you require. So, yay.
So, yeah, I'm just going to add, by increasing temperature after the drying phase, I trigger the Maillard reaction to start a little earlier. So I also get a little bit more taste out of it. But we're talking a very few degrees and a very short time. So I think from to today and just 3 months ago, my roast time has increased about 30 seconds. Just to drive out some metallic taste a little bit, some slight astringency. I don't like that, but I like it just to be sweet and acidic in a good balance.
Oh, you got one up here.
Sorry. Do we have?
There's some up here, yeah.
Who's that? Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
You again.
Yeah. I also apologise about the questions, guys. I just have many questions in my head. Recently Ben has joined the team at Wendelboe, and I think it's really awesome and interesting to get people who roast with different perspectives, who kind of bring in these ideas from outside, and just make us really reevaluate the reasons why we do things. And the things that I noticed while Tim was away, and it was Astrid, Ben and I doing QC together, is that Ben focuses on turning point more, like he looks at it, and it's something that we have never looked at before. When we analyse our profiles, I don't look at the turning point and go, well, that's the reason why this happened. And I'm really curious as to see how much your turning point factors into decisions you make about your profile and other things that would be imperative for you to pay attention to when analysing your profiles and making decisions about changing or replicating or whatever. So.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, turning point is, it's an artifact in the sense of like, it's not directly affecting the flavor, but it is showing you the initial stages or the initial heat transfer in the roasting system. So if my turnaround point is off of normal, I understand like, oh, I've got way too much heat in the drum, or I've got a lot less, and that then affects the entire rest of the profile, including pressure development and some of those other elements. And so I'll kind of take a look at that and then readjust in order to match up with the rest of the profile and then finish.
So would you say that it has more to do with the cooling of the drum between batches? That would be a direct effect on the turning point?
It could
be. We've been experimenting with that, and I think that it's really interesting to try and get some concrete answers as to why that is.
Absolutely, and sometimes too it's the cooling of the actual thermocouple. So even if our drum is warmer, because I'm on a 35 for most of our production, the Loring 35, and the thermocouple's in the door, and so if we're hot loading, I'm actually leaving the door open to keep the drum from getting too hot before I load the next batch in, and so then I immediately close it, so my turnaround is all of a sudden at, 30 seconds instead of the normal 45, but it's because the thermocouple had already cooled off significantly, and then I close the door.
So what would you do to counteract that? Say that's happened, you can't change the roaster from cooling in the time that it did, or like losing that temperature.
Right.
What would you do to kind of...
So I just adjust my heat inputs at that point. So, for the most part,
catch up with the curve, or...
Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, as soon as I go through turning point, I match up with the curve as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And as soon as I match up with the curve, the rest usually will progress pretty standard. And then cupping it will be a dead match with the other coffees from that curve, yeah. So it's more of an artifact, in my personal opinion, but others will probably have different opinions. So.
Do you guys have a different opinion, or is it just...
I think it's measurable what happens from when the turning point happens and then to first crack. So my start temperature depends, of course, like everybody else, on the batch size. We have a 15 kilo and it's flexible down to 3 kilos. So of course the start temperature can be everything from 160 to 245. 245 is a high temp. As long as I have a good turning point, because if I have turning point at 65 degrees or 75 degrees and I anticipate my first crack to be at 200, we're talking about two different stretches, one having maybe 10 degrees more than the other, leaving the average temperature slightly higher, and that would change, of course, the way you roast, since your rate of rise has to be faster. So, as consistent as possible.
Yeah.
When you have it, you think it works, stick to your turning point real good.
A question from Anna.
I noticed that most of your information that you were presenting was either from the mid of the 20th century, or like the last graph was like 2000, and now it's 2015. And as a manager, I see that all the information we have is based on some outdated science or chemistry solutions that might have really changed through the years, especially like last 10 years when the coffee industry was developing a lot. Have you heard about some interesting scientific researches that are somewhere in the world going about the roasting? Because for me, managing the company who's based on the roasting and the coffee shops, it's hard to base all the decisions just on your perceptions and, you know, like the tongue. I can trust some people, and some people, you know, are very based on their own, I don't know, maybe reactions or something.
Yeah.
So are there something like serious literature, not just, you know, the pictures with, you know, like simple books for simple things, but is there something serious in the industry going on? Or not yet?
There's a lot of research happening at the moment. So far as people working on the science in coffee, actually Morten's right back there, Mr. Munchow. So he's working with the University of Copenhagen doing a lot of scientific research in and related to coffee. With the PowerPoint, I didn't put citations. In the back of the book, I do have a list of citations of other references, some a little bit more modern. But it was all basically what I could get access to, reading at night after I would get home from work. So a lot of it may be potentially outdated information, but so far as finding better information, I'm not sure as to where to come about that. So a lot of it too, since I do some curriculum development with the SCAA, I am able to use some of their literature that they have as well for basing it. So some of it is a little bit more modern, but some is older as well. Civets and Illy did a lot of really cool research, and you know, the problem is a lot of the larger companies that can afford to do the research don't actually publish, which is unfortunate. But
yeah, so I was thinking about Morten again when she asked the question, but Morten's going to have a presentation tomorrow on roast defect. But Dimitri, you had a question as well.
Now we discuss only roasting profile, but I'm roast coffee and know that roasting coffee is not the end in the roaster, it's the end in a cooler. What about cooling down profile? Because I have some experiments and it's really big difference.
yeah.
You work with cooling down profiles, or you just use only one profile for cooling down the beans?
So I've never played around with cooling down profiles. I think it's fascinating. A friend of mine in the US actually has a thermocouple in his cooling tray and does record the profile coming off of it, which he uses simultaneously to tell when he needs to clean his pipes, because he can see that the curve has changed significantly and he knows he needs to go in there with the brush and get to work. But no, you're absolutely right. The cooling down of the coffee is incredibly significant. It needs to happen sufficiently fast, probably under 4 minutes. In order to actually arrest the roast.
Yes.
But with a longer cool down time, it changes the flavor considerably.
1 year ago, I think the same, that 4 minutes, 35 degrees, and now I'm playing with cooling down, and I know that for distribution sugar inside the beans, it's really important for playing with this. Because now I'm playing like just drop coffee, and 2 minutes I'm just rotation coffee in a cooler without air, in like 120 degrees, and later cooling beans. It will be sweeter, more body, more fruity. It's important. No big. It's really important. I think we need see for roasting, not only for these lines. I see it every day, 50 times.
No, absolutely. And a lot of the chemical reactions that are happening are going to continue happening as it goes into the cooling tray, just because heat isn't being applied. Depending on where you are in the batch, there's going to be sufficient thermal momentum to keep some of those chemical reactions happening. So there's probably going to be some that you could actually cross over. But yeah, I don't think, it's like one of those things where you just open Pandora's box, which I think is awesome. But from the production standpoint, kind of like what we talked about with some things earlier, how to control that in a meaningful way that's reproducible so that your customers don't notice the difference is going to be the interesting, challenging part. But no, I think it's awesome.
Can I add to that? I know a chocolate maker, and he claims that after making his chocolate, or was it even you, Jonas, who told me that when you make chocolate, you should cool your product as fast as possible to like crystallize the sugars as fast as possible in order to make it extra sweet. I don't know if that applies to coffee also.
I think we've got a good discussion for tonight and the coming day, but we have to end this nice session here. And thank you for the panel. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, everyone.